here in person, but also online. In fact, I have found that often in talks, even now, we have more people online than we have in person, and you are all heartily welcome to be involved indeed in this talk. My job is basically to introduce not Beth Simmons, who happens to be standing right over here. That would be Julian Wucherpfennig's job. He comes to us indeed. He is a professor of international affairs and security at the Hertie School and part of the Center for International Security. And he will say more about Beth in a minute. My job is really simply to introduce this series. For the last 3 semesters, in fact, we have been hosting an event series entitled Understanding the Politics and Policies of Exclusion. This follows on a study that our foundation, the Hertie Stiftung, has commissioned to examine indeed some facets of its past and some facets of its history. For those of you who maybe don't know, the Hertie name is best known perhaps in the post-war period as being a chain of department stores. In the early 1970s, in fact, the family that then had the chain of department stores sold a certain portion of it, and that helped set up the foundation. There is then a different foundation that's set up later that is not indeed our foundation. If I go back though, before World War II, a Jewish family, the Tietz family, owned the department stores, and indeed they were Aryanized under the Nazi regime. After they were forced to sell their company assets, members of the Tietz family moved, in fact, to the United States, but also elsewhere. And the foundation has commissioned a study to really go into some of the details of what happened in this period. Now, what we decided to do as a Hertie School is to say, we are a university, we're a public policy school, and we are interested in helping to set the scene so that when this report is ultimately published, you have some idea and understand perhaps what comes from this report. And what we've done in terms of our talks is we usually had one early in the semester that looked at some of the history. For example, what did Aryanization mean in the 1930s? In some cases, it meant out and out just taking something. In other cases, it meant, and this is interesting in terms of those of us who study financial crises, it meant that Aryan firms got bailout, but Jewish firms did not. So there are different sorts of ways indeed of doing this. We also then usually have something that's more contemporary because we look at some of these historical factors as a public policy school to say, well, there's some lessons for today. It's not just meant to be for history. This means that, for example, we've had Joachim Schrolisek, who came to talk about firms. We had Daniel Ziblatt, who you may know, who came and talked about some policies of exclusion today. Geneviève LeBaron looked at issues of forced labor, both historically and also today. And I'm delighted to say that Beth Simmons is here in a talk talking about, again, border anxiety that I think will fit quite nicely into this series. So I hope I gave you more information about what this series is about and why we're delighted to have you be part of it. Without further ado, though, I turn over the floor to Julian Wucherpfennig. Excuse me, Julian, I can't say it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and good evening, everyone, both online and on site. My name is Julian Wucherpfennig, Professor of International Affairs and Security here at the Hertie School, and it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce to you our distinguished speaker tonight, Professor Beth Simmons. She is the Andrea Mitchell University Professor in Law, Political Science, and Business Ethics at the University of Pennsylvania. And so as her title suggests, she works and has contributed significantly to several fields, including international relations, international political economy, and international law. More specifically, she is particularly well known for her research on the international political economy during the interwar years, policy diffusion at a global level, and her work demonstrating the influence that international law has on human rights outcomes across the world. And more recently, of course, also her work on border politics, about which we will hear tonight. She has repeatedly published in the most prestigious outlets, has won numerous awards for her research, and has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. So you get the idea. I could say so much more about Professor Simmons' truly outstanding record, but since you're much more interested in what she has to say, let me simply say that it would not be an understatement to refer to Professor Simmons as an academic giant who has not only pushed scientific boundaries, but also cut across disciplinary boundaries from political science, law, business, and other fields in the most fruitful and successful ways. So speaking of boundaries or borders, that gets me to the topic of tonight's talk, which is about borders or border anxiety in a globalizing world, and which I believe will address the fact that international borders have become a growing concern in all parts of the world. And of course, the Russian war in Ukraine tragically lends contemporary relevance to the topic, but terms like Brexit, including the Northern Ireland Border Protocol, the so-called refugee crisis, including recent events at the Polish-Belarusian border or the border wall at the US southern border, are just a few other examples of instances in which exclusion along international borders is the central issue. One thing I need to mention, and I'm sure
ago now, and we sort of kept putting it off, and to Svenja for all the work she did on the logistics to make this possible to happen tonight. So thank you very much. And I would definitely like to pick up on the themes that you introduced, Julian, because we thought sort of this golden age of globalization, it really started going in the 90s. And I remember when we were working on international political economy topics in the 90s, the late 90s, we were all about diffusion and open borders. We were all about the free movement of capital. We were all about the free movement, open trade relations, et cetera. It was sort of our sense that globalization was somehow here to stay. And I did, exactly so. We don't, this has hardly been the case. There have been lots of challenges to this sort of idea of an open global international order. And it is not your imagination. The world is becoming more fragmented in ways that we probably did not expect only a few years ago. So, what happens though, I think, is that this narrative of something sort of scary across borders has developed. It has diffused to a certain extent, which is not to deny danger on the other side of borders, but that it is potentially a narrative that can be taken up and used in ways that are politically convenient for some national leaders. So this is the world in which increasingly we are living in, one with growing border walls, border infrastructure, and as I'm going to talk about today, border anxiety as well. So as I guess the sort of academic and the policy leaders of today and tomorrow, everyone here in this room and online, and I'd like to welcome you online as well. So thank you very much for coming. The world in which we are now dealing. This is the world in which new policies will have to be fashioned, and we need to think very carefully about the consequences of this bordering. So the 1990s was, of course, a period of globalization. You're all so familiar. And in fact, I just went to the Wall Museum this morning, and it was quite an experience to watch tears streaming from the eyes of Germans who had made their way across the Berlin Wall, some of them for the first times in their lives, but some to be reunited with people on the other side. And this, of course, is a very poignant image that sort of gave us somehow the sense that this was to be for a long time. This was going to be the trajectory going forward. And while that has been the case in Germany, it has not been the case in much of the rest of the world, my own country included, that in a few minutes. So this symbol was an erasure, a symbol of an erasure of political divisions, and we thought sort of the rise of connectiveness would be here forever. And so, this is kind of the world we imagine ourselves in. And yes, you online are participating in an almost borderless world. That is, unless you're having some kind of trouble logging in. But basically, it's very easy to access it. It turns out not everywhere in the world is it very easy to access the internet, which is another bordering issue we could be talking about tonight. And I've been doing a little bit of research on that as well. But essentially, this is the world we thought that we were going to inhabit. The one that is essentially costless for us to make connection with people around the world. But in fact, this is the world, sorry, not that world. This is the world that we are now inhabiting, one in which border walls and infrastructure, very complex, very high-tech infrastructure between nations is being developed and redeveloped. And in fact, there's been a huge acceleration since 2010. So just to count border walls, this is several different researchers have made the effort to count the number of border walls in the world. And some of the names are up there in the upper left-hand corner. The project that I've been working on with a team of researchers is that blue line that sort of reaches the top of the graph there. And what you can see is a massive acceleration in particular since 2010. And I think that is that's an important and drastic increase that we should be putting our minds to trying to understand why this is happening. It is not simply, though, that are increasingly erecting borders. It is also that there's really been a change in discourse about borders over time. And you're probably familiar with Ngrams, Google Books Ngrams, where you can easily go in. This is it's high tech that somebody invented. It's super easy for me and for you to access Ngrams and put in some words or word phrases that you're interested in, and it pops out the density over time of those word phrases. And that's what's shown here. This is how the discourse has changed over time. You can see on the one hand that in the 90s we were talking about, this is mainly from books found in libraries. This is in the 90s, and this is in English, by the way. This is in American English, by the way. So this is this borderless world kind of going, it dips down and kind assumption of the territorial integrity of the state. But at the same time, and only within a few years of reestablishing that order, something else was embroidered on top of it. And that was the liberal international order. This was the order that made a lot of contributions to the territorial one. That, it shouldn't matter sort of where you are to access capital. It shouldn't matter where you are situated to access information. That there would be a free movement of traded goods and capital across borders. And you're familiar with these institutions. the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, followed up by the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, which was meant to liberalize economic relations between states, the European Community, and I want to say also the Universal Declaration on Human Rights as well. The idea is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It doesn't matter whether you stand on the United States side of the border or the Mexican side of the border. You're entitled to what's in that document. And so the interesting thing to me is the set of contradictions that comes out of a situation in which you've established the state territorially and said, that's your authority. And at the same time, you said, let's kind of have a system that the elite among us can kind of glide above in some sense. And so, this is kind of, I don't know, I find this very evocative right here for what we are talking about. It's sort of like there's been developed this historical building as the foundation, firmly rooted in territoriality, the very traditional ideas, the solid brick and mortar foundation of the nation state in some sense, firmly grounded in the earth. And then soaring above it, what do you have? Is the modern liberal vision, which scarcely looks grounded at all. You see a little edge of it is kind of stuck on the ground there, but it's pointing upward. It's saying we can transcend what is kind of physically rooted in the ground. And this juxtaposition, I don't know how you feel about that. Some people like that kind of thing. Some people don't like it. It's one or the other, but don't stick those things together. And I feel like that is kind of some of the contradictions we are dealing with right now. Some of us benefit hugely from both the security our state provides, as well as the privileges we have to sort of soar above everything else happening. We travel fairly freely, for example. We have good access to the internet all the time. German and US visas are among the most powerful visas in the world, for example, none of which ought to be taken for granted. But for much of the world, that is not an easy sort of image to sort of take on board and live with. So I think that's kind of what's happening in the background here. So for the rest of the discussion, I want to try to produce some new evidence about that. First, I'll talk about sort of emotive discourse and provide some evidence about border anxiety in global official rhetoric. And then I'll be turning a little bit more to the infrastructural situation. And I will argue that there's a relationship between these things. I will argue, and I have a paper coming out arguing, that the anxious language is the leading indicator of what is actually put in place on the ground. Okay? So let's begin first of all with this idea of emotive discourse, border anxiety, and I think the best thing to do is to show you evidence of this anxious discourse surrounding borders in official rhetoric. So the place that my research team has been looking for some of this evidence are the United Nations General Assembly debates, which is an important source of political intelligence hidden right before our eyes. And I think we would be remiss not to start there. Not that this finishes everything we need to know about discourse, but I think it's a very important part of the picture. And so we used the annual speeches in this discourse, in which each and every state gets about 15 minutes to say whatever they want to say. Okay, so no one tells them what they have to say. They can choose to suck up to a major power if they want to, or they can use it as a time to talk about conflict. They can use it for whatever they want, essentially. And so this is the perfect opportunity to get a sense of what states are worried about. Okay, so what we did was to take that language, to take those speeches, separate them into paragraphs, and then what we tried to do was to figure out the proportion of border relevant language. No details here in this context about how we did that, but it wasn't just a word search. It was partially human coding and partially computer learning sort of a model. So we took every paragraph since 1970, and we worked out this algorithm for which ones were so-called border relevant. And I think the results were quite interesting. This is just a graph of the density of those paragraphs that are border relevant. And so it's really very clear that the share of paragraphs in annual speeches in the United Nations General Assembly, that proportion that are border relevant, is increasing over time, and in particular, again, accelerating around 2010. But what are they talking about? And how are they talking about it? So the next thing we tried to do was to sort of say, what are the sentiments around this language? So we looked at the affect, essentially, of the language, sentiments and emotions. And I guess you can ask, who cares how states feel? But it seems to me that there is pretty good psychological evidence existing out there that affective dynamics influence actors' beliefs, it influences their judgments, it influences their preferences, and very importantly, it affects their willingness to take on risk or not. So it affects their judgments about risk. All of these hugely, of course, relevant to the conduct of foreign policy and international relations. So we gauged these sentiments in these paragraphs here. I'm going to show you a picture. We essentially did this. Well, we did it two ways. First of all, just using Google sentiments, which you can imagine is not very good for diplomatic speak, right? So just the kind of Google engine that produces sentiments was a rough cut. But then what we did was we took human coding and supervised learning, and they're very closely correlated, actually. So we get some of the same results, essentially. This is what we found. Now, this is a picture of negative sentiments expressed in those paragraphs. And essentially, high is more positive, and low is more negative. And I'm not sure if you can read the letters there, but the red curve essentially is the borders only paragraph. And the blue one is all the rest of speech, because it would be a little bit meaningless, I think, essentially say, oh, states are getting more negative about borders if they're getting more negative about everything. It turns out there's still a lot of happy talk in the United Nations. There's still a lot of very positive speech. But in contrast to that are the negative sentiments in the border paragraphs, always lower than all speeches, tracking them closely, but look at what happens in 2010. They drastically come apart. We can get even more precise about what these sentiments are about. We can put an emotion on them. And I'm going to call that emotion anxiety. Now, be careful, because I don't know if these guys are anxious or not. These persons are anxious or not. Maybe they are anxious. Maybe they just have political reasons to sound anxious. So we are quite aware that we are not psychologists and not have tapped into their exact emotions. We've provided evidence of their rhetoric. That's really what we're trying to do here. So we used a dictionary of words related to anxiety. We used the synonyms, the antonyms, and on the next picture I'm going to show you, high is more anxious and low is less anxious, essentially. And that's what these curves show you here. Again, red are the border relevant paragraphs, and blue are the non-border relevant paragraphs. So what you can see here is states have always been more anxious about borders than almost everything else they speak about. Well, what they speak about in general anyway. But not only that, that gap is growing over years. Not only is it growing, look at that, the 1990s again, we talked about the globalization when everybody was sanguine about peace and borders and globalization, but then the upswing again in the last 10 years is very, very palpable. So why should this matter to us? Well, we just did a little bit of an analysis and find out sort of how this language kind of spreads around. And you know what? It turns out the strongest predictor of anxious language is not immigrants at your border, is not violence on the other side of the border. It is how the rest of the world, and in particular your region, the language they used in the previous year in border-related paragraphs, suggesting, not proving, suggesting that there is a diffusion of a narrative around international borders that's sort of catching on and becoming prevalent. And we might ask, so what? Who cares? Who listens to the speeches anyway, right? Well, it turns out actually domestic audiences in a lot of places do listen to these speeches, especially in some of the smaller countries around the world. People really do listen to what their leaders say at the United Nations. But quite aside from that, we found a very strong correlation between the language, the degree of anxiety in the language, and the degree of negative sentiment in the language in the previous period and the likelihood to begin building a wall in the next 2 periods, a wall or fence in the next 2 periods. And so this suggests that these words are leading indicators for action taken on the ground. And that was in a model controlling for immigration, political violence, GDP per capita, because everybody knows rich countries do this, build border structures much more than poor countries do. So controlling for a lot of things, that was still the relationship. So what is going on at borders? First of all, then, sentiment and anxiety are convincingly correlated with border hardening, controlling for a lot of other aspects of what's truly going on the ground. So let's dig a little bit more deeply into border structure. And I've been talking kind of about walls and beginning walls and that kind of thing. Walls are not all that we should be talking about. We also need to be thinking about border crossings as well, and what kind of security structure is in border zones more generally. And so I've been working with a team that has been working around on this kind of topic of trying to figure out about sort of border thickness more generally, and still focused on infrastructure though. And so what we started to do, and what we've now completed essentially, is to create a far more robust kind of an indicator of border infrastructure, including and primarily based on border crossings and what we see at border crossings. Some are just places where you can apparently just drive through, right? There's nobody there, no state representatives there to stop you. But we went through and we coded all the gates that are at in border crossings, split lanes. Split lanes are places where you can inspect, where you can pull over. That's a state capacity to do that. Official buildings, we had a definition of what an official building is. This is all using Google Earth, essentially. And multi-lane roads, which are sometimes these fanning out structures, again, where you can sort of filter the traffic coming through. So we used Google Earth. We came up with all border crossings in the world, not official border crossings, but wherever there was a major road crossing an international border. So you can imagine, like, these are roads, you can imagine these are borders, and wherever those intersect, we zoomed in there and we got the latitude and longitude, and we geocoded those. In addition, of course, we have the geocode. We have new geocoded data on border walls too. So that means not just country A and country B have border walls, but we can tell you the latitude and longitude of every segment of those border walls. And then finally, we have law enforcement in border zones. And for this, we don't have a time series on, but we do have at least a measure. And this is drawn from OpenStreetMaps, and we have all the police stations, and we have the density of police stations over the population, relative to population, because that always matters. And then we take that ratio and compare it to the same ratio internally, not in the border zone, okay, because, you know, police stations are everywhere. So that is essentially this kind of measure that we are trying to get this sort of sense of the thickness of the border. And when we take that data and graph it worldwide, this is something of what we get. Now here, how should you interpret this? The balls are border crossings. The colors of the borders are where we have data and are able to average those scores together. And you can see that red means that it is a very, very high likelihood you're going to be stopped and filtered, and green means there's practically nothing we can find on that border. Let me zoom in to show you just a little bit more. There's Europe. This is not totally up to date because we're still like, this picture was made with about 3 years of data that were not included, but you know, this is essentially what we have. You can see some pretty obvious things. We're capturing basically what's going on. You know, you have the Schengen area, the internal parts of Europe are very green, very easy to get through, but boy, you have that outer edge, which is quite hardened. Okay? You can see that Norway's all green up there, but they've got that, you know, orange place up there that where they touch Russia, for example. So that just sort of gives you a sense. This is my country. There's a difference between north and south, a big difference between north and south. You get the idea that it is possible to go well beyond walls, but to look at the nature of, you know, who's really there guarding the border? What state authority is there? And so that's what we've been working on. And we do have as I told you, we don't have a time series on the police station measures, But we do on the other two measures, and this gives you sort of a sense over time of where some of the major changes have been. Why is Europe straight going all the way across? Because I've mixed, the European Union's internal areas with the outside, and if you take those apart, they go like that. Okay. But the other thing I want to point out is a lot of this is happening in Africa and the Middle East. A lot of the growth is in Africa and the Middle East. Okay, so now let's talk now about, finally, this is the last thing I really wanted to do, is to talk a little bit about the consequences. And, I don't have a fully formed idea yet about what the consequences are, but I know some of the questions I want to ask. And some of the questions I want to ask include things like, does it affect relationships between the two states when a border wall or structures are put up on the border? Does it affect human rights, for example? Does it affect human well-being to put a very hard border between states? And so, we're working in this area and the work continues, but I do want to show you just a little bit of evidence. And I also want to say that it's not as though there's very strong evidence that border hardening is very helpful. So I can name you all kinds of studies that are highly skeptical on the economic benefits, on the immigration control benefits, on the kind of transnational crime fighting benefits, on the public health benefits around COVID and other kinds of transmissible diseases, the security benefits in civil war settings. There's a lot of skeptical literature out there. So I just sort of wanted to really kind of zoom in on this question. If it's not doing much good, is it doing any harm? So that's what I'm going to show you next. And the first thing is to just draw your attention to a study that I did with Diana Mutz that tries to ask this question: is sort of how is it sort of seen by other people that two countries put a border wall in front of them? So we want to sort of say, this question, do you support a border wall or not? That is so politically divisive. That's not a good way to study it. So what we did instead was we made a little video about Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, who nobody in the United States knows anything about. And we also fielded this, so in the United States, in Ireland, and in Turkey, three very different countries with respect to the assumptions around the purposes and benefits of border walling. Okay, so almost opposites, or very different anyway. We'll just leave it at that. And I don't know if there's time to show this little video. It's 3.5 minutes. Shall I show you really quickly? Sorry? Oh, okay. So let me go like this and ask the video to come on. So what we're trying to do, the treatment is a vision of the wall. The treatment is a vision of the wall, and then I'm going to ask questions about the nature of the relationship between these two countries. Okay? Okay, this is not in the control picture. This is the treatment. That's the control picture. You also get that in this film too. You're getting the treatment version.
Tajikistan is a country at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Located in Central Asia, this country is extremely mountainous, with mountains covering 90% of Tajikistan. Tajikistan shares a border with Kyrgyzstan, another independent country.
Same in both. Same in both.
Historically, Tajikistan was part of various Chinese dynasties and an important stop on the Silk Road. Genghis Khan once ruled Tajikistan as part of his Asian empire. After his empire collapsed, Tajikistan became part of a number of smaller empires until the region became part of the Soviet Union. In 1991, Tajikistan declared independence as a country, around the same time that many of its neighboring countries, such as Kyrgyzstan, also declared their independence.
Treatment. This is treatment.
The long border between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan was begun that same year.
That's just a view across the horizon in the control group.
Tajikistan is rich in natural resources. It is home to major mining operations for gold and silver and is one of the largest aluminium producers in the world. Outside of mining, much of the economy is agricultural and focused especially on cotton farming. Because so much of the country is mountainous, Tajikistan must import some of the food it needs to feed its population. This is the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which runs for over 600 miles. The border wall runs through the Fergana Valley, a densely populated area. The cuisine in Tajikistan is rice-based and resembles rice pilau. Rice is simmered in a meat and vegetable stew until the liquid is absorbed into the rice. Lamb, carrots, raisins are also used for flavor. The national drink is green tea. A major holiday in Tajikistan is Nowruz in late March, celebrating the beginning of planting season. The holiday celebrations are especially large in rural areas. The national sport is buzkashi, a game similar to polo that is played on horseback. In urban areas, which are located close to the border with Kyrgyzstan, competitive sports are an important part of the culture.
Treatment. We substituted all these names into local languages, depending on the country. That's the treatment look at the end, right there, already. So then we wanted to know, we asked the people sort of what effect, or, how do you think these countries feel about each other? Okay, so we're trying to strip away the politics in our own countries and all that kind of just think about these two countries you don't know anything about, and what do you think they think about each other? Okay, we did control for things like Republican and Democrat in the US, whether they supported Brexit or not in Ireland, and whether they were a member of one of the Kurdish parties in Turkey, because those might conceivably have different ideas about border walls and border walling. And the results I'm going to give you is completely net of that, and we found zero effects along those lines I just mentioned, zero. So here's what we did find right here. These are questions, for example, like how do these countries feel about each other? How are their relations? How friendly are they to each other? I circled the trust one because I think that's really a very interesting and important finding. Are they likely to trade? Do the governments cooperate? Are people likely to visit the other country, et cetera, et cetera? And so you can see systematically and across the board, these are hugely statistically significant differences. This pools the data for the United States, Ireland, and Turkey, and the results were not that different. Turkey was just a tiny bit more sympathetic there's a little less difference, a little less between Turkey. And this is kind of sort of the findings here. So it strikes me that we should be thinking anyway about what kind of an impression on international and foreign relations wall building is going to put between countries. That was one of the things I didn't mention. There was a third treatment as well. And the third treatment just added the sentence that Kyrgyzstan had built the wall. And then we took this temperature before and after the treatments, and how warm are you towards Tajikistan and how warm are you towards Kyrgyzstan? And so they've got these numbers. And it turns out if they heard that Kyrgyzstan had built the wall, that suddenly their opinion of Kyrgyzstan went downhill. Interesting. It's the country that does the building that is blamed for the wall, and not the other country assumed to be sort of out of control somehow, right? Violent or crime-ridden or some kind of a threat. So I thought that was a very, very interesting relationship as well. So that is one thing to be thinking about. What does it do to international relations, relations between neighboring states? The other thing I wanted to be thinking about are the kinds of discontinuities that hard international walls put between states. We have here three really, really stark examples. The starkest, of course, is at the top, the Korean Peninsula. And the middle example is Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And the bottom example is Tijuana and the San Diego area of the United States. All of these places have fairly hard border structures, very hard in the top case, border structures in place. So this introduces the possibility that there are important things that are stopped by strong border structures. Of course, that's the purpose, that's the point in some sense. But some things you might want to cross borders, right? You might want to, like, what happens if children near a border region have a medical emergency and the nearest hospital's on the other side of the border? Okay, so what about the discontinuities in infant mortality rates in border regions? So we took the world, we went out 30 kilometers on each side of the border, and we gathered what we could. We have only 1 year, though, of data. We gathered what we could on infant mortality rates by geolocation in those border zones. And then what we found essentially was that 80% of the world's dyadic international borders show very significant disparities. We found that when you put a placebo border in place, yes, sometimes you do see discontinuity still, sometimes you do. Placebo border is one that kind of randomly picked sort of a border. So moving the border around, but that only 27% of the time do placebo borders produce the same consequences. And most importantly, we found that that differential, the discontinuity in that border space, right at the border, essentially is correlated strongly with walls and with visa requirements not being waived, so that you have to get a visa to enter. So that suggests that we might want to be thinking about what some of the consequences are essentially for health by not sort of creating a little bit more open space where people can access the most appropriate health care, particularly in an emergency. And that controls for differences in national averages and everything else. In fact, the red lines are the national averages. Okay, so yes, there is a national average difference between those two countries being Guatemala and El Salvador. But there's also, even when you take that into account, there's a discontinuity at the border. And then finally, I want to think about, what does hardening a border do to the practice of border security? Okay, so now the question is, does it affect how border security guards and personnel actually behave? Well, how do you get data on that, right? Well, it does turn out that there are data sets, of course, you're probably familiar with, about human rights violations. And it turns out that some of these databases of human rights violations have coded how, if any violations, for example, torture, has been committed by border control agents. So it is possible to get data on this. We took an existing data set and we extended it forward. The data set, I think, ended about 20 years ago, actually. And we extended it forward, and we found, essentially, I'll give you this looks like a group that can handle some multiple regression. So I will just give you those results. So this first here, the dependent variable is the likelihood of committing torture, essentially. Is categorical. It's a set of categories. And so what we have here is, what I'm showing you first of all, is that there is no relationship between your overall torture score and your border control torture score. No relationship. Okay? So that's what the first thing there is showing you. It's slightly negative, but it's essentially zero, controlling for several other things. What happens now when you look at the effect of building a wall on these practices? So there's the one I just showed you. Now if you add, now let's look at the wall. What happens when you build a wall is that you sort of get this now positive relationship with torture committed at the border. Now, let me be careful. I don't know the direction of causation, okay? I don't know the direction of causation. This is something that we should be investigating, though, in my book. This is something we should be looking into, because we don't know, for example, if the wall is put into place in an already horrific situation where all kinds of things bad are happening at the border, and this is a hopeless position for border control to be in. Or on the other hand, does building a wall make them suddenly feel very sort of empowered to do what they would like to do at the border? And with this in mind, I am recalled to mind, I don't know if this ever made the news outside of the United States, but there was an incident in which U.S. Border Patrol agents in the United States got on horseback and were carrying whips and were slashing at people crossing the border. I don't know if you saw that here, but you got to wonder, we don't go around whipping people in the United States. What sort of makes that okay in some sense? And I don't know that it is per se walling, but maybe it is something about the sense that the border must be protected at all costs. That is the kind of mentality that accompanies border hardening. Okay, so that's essentially what I think we should be sort of investigating in a situation like this, when we think about the consequences of border hardening. So let me just wrap up by saying a few things. One is that, we have sort of built this conflict and clash between two global orders. And we've told states, you're sovereign in your territory, do what you want to do, protect your borders. That's part of kind of territorially where that defines and defends your jurisdiction, your authority and your legitimacy, right? On the one hand. And then on the other hand, we built this system that is constantly stressing those seams and sort of gliding over it and creating challenges, not just for states, but groups within states as well, right? If you find there's been deindustrialization because investment funds are going overseas, for example. So, so this is a fraught situation, I think we can fairly say. There's growing evidence that it's, sort of being found both in, I think, official discourse. It's being found, this evidence is being now found on the ground around the world, both at borders in terms of walls, but also at border crossings, and also in police presence around international borders. And these trends are not always connected with real situations and real conditions on the ground. So it is a little bit disconcerting that the negative discourse displays evidence of diffusion, but also predicts that a given country will harden its border. So really, is that necessary? Or is that sort of the politically available sort of move to make? And then finally, I think we need to be thinking about the consequences. Border hardening, I think, has had some unexpected consequences, and many that we didn't anticipate, and many that I can speak for myself, I would not really want to try to further. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating yet frightening talk, I should say. Wonderful opportunity to learn about all this great work. We now have a chance to ask questions. This goes both to the audience here in the room and also people online. And while you're getting ready, perhaps I can ask a first question. So we'll start with a perhaps even relatively hard question. The first part of your talk was all about this border anxiety, which you then told us is a leading driver of border hardening, border walls. And then you told us about the consequences of border walls. Now, what I'm curious to hear is your thoughts on whether you really see, you suspect an effect of border walls by itself, or whether it is actually more of a symptom of underlying differences between states that manifest themselves in walls and then also at the same time play out in the sorts of outcomes that you have described, torture along border walls and so on.
So that is a hard question, and that's not going to be answered in 30 minutes, and it's not going to probably be answered in the next 5 to 10 years, is my guess. But I can tell you that we need to be doing that kind of work to try to figure it out. So one thing I'm really careful to not do is to use the word driver of. I think that's way beyond where the evidence is right now. I like to use leading indicator. Mm-hmm. And I like to use leading indicator because it warns us that there are some things states are worried about, and we should be finding cooperative and creative ways to try to address those issues, not by hardening borders necessarily. So if states are worried that they are going to be facing immigration waves, there need to be some policies in place that address kind of root causes instead of sort of, building these sorts of structures between states. So that's one thing. And then, of course, some of these borders are hardened in places, exactly what I was saying at the end, hardened in places that are already experiencing all kinds of violence, and already are problematic spaces for one reason or another. So the way to begin to investigate that is to sort of be thinking about models that look at the difference in the relationship before a structure is put in place, and trying to look at the relationship in that border region afterwards and looking for discontinuities. And if we see some discontinuities there, we're getting a little bit closer to a research structure, a difference in difference kind of a research structure, where we can begin to say something a little bit more causal than we can say at this time. So that's where we need to be going. It's not easy. We also, of course, need to be doing a lot of very close case studies to figure out. So for example, I think we should be, and I would like to turn some of my attention to looking at, can an ambulance come through the Mexican border? I don't know. I need to figure out, if emergency vehicles can get through, if there's a medical emergency, what is the protocol? And, that would be very important. So those, that kind of thing can be dug up using case studies.
Thank you. Questions by the audience, and if you could please identify yourself first, that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be perfect. Yeah, we have a mic here. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, hard to nail, but the way we structured those results was that there's a 2-year lag between talking and doing, and then another lag between doing and torturing. So I mean, that's sort of a cheap answer in some sense that we worked with the lag structure, but and I'm sure there are some instances in which I wouldn't say that torture causes walling. I would never want to kind of go in that direction. But there are some instances in which very empowered agents are demanding the wall, for example, demanding that for better border control. And it's going to, if you're not careful with your lag structure, it's going to show up as, those are empowered agents and they got the wall. The wall made them feel empowered. It strikes me there's a lot of room here for experimental evidence too, right? So to look at the sort of an intervention, not a little different from. I still think you might want to keep it third person though. So not like I just really feel like you can't do this kind of thing in the United States right now because you'll just get partisanship. It's all you would get. That's all, and nothing moves because everybody believes what they believe. But to sort of use a treatment of a border wall and then just sort of ask a respondent, sort of what means are appropriate for enforcing this border. And it would be interesting to see whether sort of pictures of walls make them feel all means necessary or whether it makes no difference at all. As you'll find out, I have more ideas for research than I do for research that I've actually finished.
Yes, please. Do we have questions online as well? I can't see the screen here. Please.
I have a question just about September 11, actually. I didn't see a lot of, maybe with the speeches in the UN, I saw some spikes there, but I didn't see a correlation. Can you explain more?
There is a little bit of a correlation. There's not a correlation just with it, but for some countries there is. So the United States does start border hardening around that time. It takes a while to build a fence, to get the legislation through, to do the appropriations, to make the design, to literally get, in the United States, it's private property. In Texas, it's private property. Actually, it's federal property in a lot of Arizona. So there are property rights issues you have to mess through and all this kind of stuff. These are projects that are delayed from September 11th. In the United States, I just gave you the US case. I think Saudi Arabia can do whatever they want to do when they're ready to do it, essentially. And they are one of the hardest of hard borders you can imagine. And it went up very quickly. Your question again was, why didn't September 11th show up? Because I think that there is a delay, but I don't think that generalized around the world in the same way. That this kind of more narrative about, that's a little bit more kind of connected with maybe some populism in the advanced industrialized societies, but also actually it's very interesting, the impact in the Middle East that the Syrian civil war and ISIS and the Iraq war had there. Those borders have very different reasons for existing. Those very much are grounded in transnational violent challenges to the nation state. So ISIS kind of form a sort of transboundary caliphate, and there are images on the internet and YouTube that show, them taking their tractors and just banging down and state reinforcements. That's the kind of thing that explains the growth in hardening in that region. And there, remember that the picture that showed a lot of that. There's a lot of that is accounted for by the Middle East, and they are among the most anxious about their borders as several of the Middle Eastern countries.
Right. Should we take a question from the online panel, if that's possible? I see, is that a hand by Catherine? Is that correct? Catherine, do you want to?
Yeah, that's me. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you?
Yep.
We can hear you.
We can hear
yes.
you.
Oh, hello, Professor Simmons, and I'm very sorry not to be there in person. I'm also bringing lots of apologies from colleagues at the Center for Fundamental Rights. I had a question about the conceptual idea of hardening, which has such this very strong focus on infrastructure. Because I tend to think that most of the heavy lifting in migration control is done with visa policies, which was coming through towards the end of the talk as well. And visas are, very much processed in cyberspace at a distance. And then there's a lot of sort of deterritorialization of migration control with visas. And so I just wondered, because intuitively, I suppose, and just from other understanding, I tend to think of a lot of the infrastructure as symbolic. And so the whole direction of your paper seems to be saying, no, the control and the infrastructure are what's really changing policies and practices. And I just wondered about that. I mean, to me, it's really intriguing because it sort of goes against something that I would have previously thought, that a lot of the walls and things are spectacle because there's a lot of symbolic politics in this area, but the real heavy lifting of the distribution of mobility opportunities is done through visas. Most people are deterred from moving. Only the most desperate then try to move when they've been illegalized or. And then secondly, if you
Can I answer that
time,
one first, Catherine? Do you mind if I go with that one first?
Sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I mean, if you read the articles I've done, I couldn't agree with you more that there's a huge symbolic angle to this, which doesn't undercut anything I've said, right? It's symbolic but impactful at the same time. Those are not contradictions. You can be putting up these structures for your political reasons, right? Maybe you have a right-wing constituency that needs to see this kind of structure. And by the way, people feel safer, actually. They do feel safer with border security. So that's one of the findings actually in the Tajikistan-Kyrgyzstan study. That's the only finding that was the least bit positive about the effect of the wall. All the affect between the two countries was negative, but you ask people, is the border more secure? And the respondents said, yes, it's more secure. So there's a ton of symbolic meaning around securing a border, and that's absolutely true. But that's not a contradiction with anything I've said. Anxiety, put up a border. Why? Maybe because you need to convince an audience at home that you're doing something for them, right? That you're doing something meaningful for them. Hey, they don't care if you've got, some heat sensing thing somewhere, offshore or what have you. They want to see what you're doing. They want to see the patrol boats. They want to see the fences and the walls going up and down. I feel better. I could say a lot of things about some other studies we've done in the United States. I have a feeling you don't need to hear all this. But I agree with you on that. Yes, there's a lot of heavy work being done by visas. Where? In airports. In airports, where all of us have been lately, right? At airports. We feel those visas. Where it's a lot less important to have visas is controlling Boko Haram in the Nigerian hinterland, for example. That's a very different situation. Controlling ISIS. So, to the extent that some of the anxiety is around security concerns, and they really are, a lot of the anxieties around security concerns for sure, that the visas don't do the work. They don't do the work, and they don't even do the work on the US-Mexican border, for example, if nobody's there to inspect them. So you can cross over, but you can disappear fairly quickly, somewhere in Texas or in, somewhere in the deeper in the United States, if no one has sort of made an effort to stop and inspect. So the key for me, Catherine, is filtering. And yes, you can create laws. Can you enforce them? That's what a lot of the structure is doing. And, by the way, we should not mistake these structures for being effective filters either. That we need to be, skeptical about, I think, as well.
Great. Thank you so much.
Do you have another, if you wanted to continue, I just had to get that out.
I can't see how many hands you have up in the room, but if
there's none up in the room.
Oh, okay. Well, then my second question, but only if you have time, was going to ask a little about the Africa story, because Africa seems so interesting with all these regional mobility agreements. And then you had this, nonetheless, this intensification of infrastructure, but only if you have time and there's nobody else waiting in the room.
So there is no the Africa story. Africa is full of different stories. The northern part of Africa has great outward migration pressures, as you well know. Big parts of Africa have precisely the transnational terrorism problem. South Africa has yet a different problem, and South Africa is one of the most strongly fortified borders in the African continent, at least what we were able to tell, largely because they are concerned with migrating labor, unwanted labor movements, essentially, and the impact on labor markets. So there's no one African story. It's a huge continent. And that continent has a whole variety of concerns, many of which will ring true to us, right? Transnational terrorism, migration, and some interstate competition as well. Oh, one other thing I want to stress with Africa too, is that it is a continent that depends on the collective customs for finance, for fiscal solvency. And so they do create some posts at their border crossings in particular, where they attempt to collect those tariffs at the borders. So some of that structure is accounted for because of that kind of fiscal dependence as well on the presence of the state at the border.
There's another question here. Okay. Any further? Mark, please.
I had also had a question about 9/11, and you already addressed that one. But I did have something else, which is about incomplete borders, or incomplete walls, perhaps. I should say I am from San Diego. My mother lives 4 exits north of the Mexican-US border. And one of the curious things is, of course, there is a wall right there. But if you go a little east into the mountains, of course, there's no wall at all. And I'm wondering, to what extent, the picture you showed made it look like in Tajikistan, and I guess it was kind of continuous. It was all around the country.
That's a drawn in, that black thing?
That's just drawn.
That's just drawn in.
Okay,
no, we're not asserting there's a wall there. It's just saying they settled the border with that slide.
Okay, good. I was looking for variation, though, on the length of the wall. This was my idea. And maybe how porous it is. Also, when I think about the torture statistics, do you have data that's within country? Like, I mean, I don't know how geolocational the data is, but is it in like that part of San Diego that's got the border versus
no, we don't know
out
that.
in the desert or anything like that? That's not.
We do not know that. That last thing we certainly don't know. We just have the Amnesty International reports that are not geolocated. The only thing that is coded is that it is a border patrol, border security, border police agent that has committed, alleged to have committed, reported to have committed an act of torture. We don't even know that they absolutely did do it. We haven't had a trial, for example. So now but the other ones were porosity.
My question was more kind of like, if you get like the length of the border,
so we do know
the length
that.
of the border that has a wall,
yeah,
right?
we do know that. We do know
how
that.
does that affect, it sounded rather dichotomous to the way you described wall and no wall. How does sort of the length of the wall, maybe where it's located, if it's in a city or something like this, does that affect your results? That's the question.
So the results being the torture results, right? Yeah. Absolutely it is. So we put a ton of effort into that, exactly. Having researchers sort of go through and literally drop the pin where wall or the fence is geolocated. Super hard to see this because you're really looking down kind of like this for most of Google Earth, right? But then we have to zoom in sideways and see if they get a view, and we triangulate with all kinds of other data sources. So would it affect the outcome? I can't say exactly. My hypothesis would be, for example, with torture, the stronger and starker the border, the more I would expect there potentially to be. Let me give you a two-tailed test, okay? So on the one hand, I would expect a stark border wall to sort of say, do whatever's necessary, right? On the other hand, let's put ourselves in the position or the shoes of a border control agent where people are slipping through holes all the time, and where they, sort of can slip through fairly easily. And that's frustrating. And darn it, I'm going to make you go back and sort of teach you not to come through that place. So I can imagine it kind of working both ways. I don't have a very clear hypothesis. One kind of works through frustration, and the other explanation, the first one, works through empowerment or a sense of entitlement to enforce the border. And it's hard to say, but if I had that kind of evidence, that's the sort of test, that's the kind of theory I would be developing.
We are nearly out of time, or we're actually over time, but I'm still going to ask one last question. What lies ahead of us? Is this going to get even worse in the future, or what are your expectations?
Yeah. So I've just sort of done a paper that argues that border walls are cooperation failures, that these are structures essentially that are mean that you don't trust each other. They mean, and by trust I mean two different things. On the one hand, trust can mean I think you might harm me. That's one meaning of trust. I don't trust you. But the other is I don't think you're capable. And this is kind of the story you hear a little bit more with the United States, Mexico. We don't think Mexico's out to get us. We think they can't enforce things on their side of the border. And when I say we, I mean kind of the national narrative and some political leaders who like to make a big deal out of it. So, so those are sort of two kind of trust problems. And it seems to me what lies ahead for us, and who is us in that sentence, but I'll just say sort of when we think about the sorts of things that should be addressed at borders, it seems to me we ought to be addressing trust relationships. That means we might put a much more higher priority than we have put in the past on, for example, developing joint joint border controls, one-stop border inspections, where two guards from each side do it together. Protocols to make sure that human rights are respected and allow for inspections of situations like that. It seems to me the more we can move towards a sort of a more multilateralized, at least bilateralized, maybe multilateral is a little too strong, but at least bilateralized, humanitarian approach in which border pairs negotiate their responsibilities and their rights in the border region, I think the closer we will come to a situation in which these kinds of structures are going to be less obviously needed.
Terrific. There is hope. I think that's a good note to end this fantastic talk tonight. Thank you very much for some very, very interesting insights. Thank you all for coming and lively debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.